you very much for coming to our Tennis Hills Saturday meeting. We are very happy to have Mr. Chandran Nair to be our guest speaker today. Our topic is China and ASEAN to work together for a new Asian century. Chandran Nair is the founder and CEO of the Global Institute for Tomorrow, an independent pan-Asian think tank based in Hong Kong and Kuala Lumpur, focused on advancing a deeper understanding of global issues, including the shift of economic and political influence from the West to Asia, the dynamic relationship between business and society, and the reshaping of the rules of global capitalism. He is the author of Dismantling Global White Privilege, Equity for a Post-Western World, the Sustainable State, the Future of Government, Economy and Society, and Consumptionomics, Asia's role in reshaping capitalism and serving the planet. He is also the creator of the Other 100, a non-profit global photojournalism initiative to present a counterpoint of media consensus on some of today's most important issues. Chandran was chairman of Environmental Resources Management in Asia Pacific until 2004, establishing the companies as Asia's leading environmental consultancy. Chandran has served as Adjunct Professor at the Hong Kong University of Science and Technology and the Kuan School of Public Policy in Singapore. He is a member of the Executive Committee of the Club of Rome and a Fellow of the Royal Society of Asia. He is also a writer, sometimes in CMP. Well, welcome Chandran Nair to be our guest again, and I'll pass the mic to Chandran. Thank you, Chandran.
Thank you, Brian, and thank you everyone for this opportunity. I'm greatly privileged to have this opportunity to talk to you all. Just as a little bit of background, so I've been in Hong Kong as a permanent resident for about 25 years. I'm a Malaysian citizen, but in many ways, I'm that global citizen too. I've lived all around the world. I lived in UK for about 8 years. Then I went to Africa to do development work for about 5 years. I was involved in what was then the liberation struggle against colonialism and the anti-apartheid movement. And then I came back to Asia. I worked in Bangkok, and then I came to Hong Kong. So Hong Kong has been very kind to me. And I like to use Hong Kong as a place to kind of observe what has happened. And of course, in recent years, the events in Hong Kong have been both food for thought in terms of some of the things I've written. They've also been the basis for a dissection of what I see as what I call the early pangs of the birth of the non-Western world, the post-Western world. And so I'm very happy to talk about that too. At the moment, I'm in Kuala Lumpur because I came to KL because we have offices here and I have family members and other things to attend to. So I came here in December with a view to going back to Hong Kong, and I was supposed to go back about 3 weeks ago, but because of this current situation, I felt more because I like to go to the office and not work from home. I decided I'll stay a few more weeks before going home. So I'm going back to Hong Kong on the 1st of April. No, sorry, 1st of May. And I can't wait to get back to Hong Kong because that's lots of things we're doing. In fact, in a later part of this year, our think tank is running a program in Hong Kong, which we run every year, to encourage people young people to stay in Hong Kong. And it's called, Stay and Build in Hong Kong and all of those sorts of things. So every year we carry out these programs to encourage people to think about Hong Kong in a different way. But today I believe I've been asked to make a few comments about the role of China in the ASEAN region, the geopolitics, about RCEP, and also the China-US relations, South China Sea, and I was also asked to talk a bit about Ukraine. But what I would like to talk about, the impact of the Ukraine conflict on how Asia views it and the rest of the world views it. And I've written some pieces about it, which I'm happy to also share with you about. So with your permission, I'll speak for about 30 minutes, and then I think it's better that I open the floor up. Being of Indian origin, I can speak for 2 hours non-stop, so that would be a very bad idea. So let me just speak for 30 minutes and then kind of open the floor up. So quickly about ASEAN. As you all will probably know, but I often feel that Hong Kong doesn't pay enough attention to ASEAN. And for over 15 years, I've been telling the Hong Kong government and others that they should look at ASEAN, because there's a long relationship in terms of overseas Chinese communities, as you all know, in Indonesia, Malaysia, Thailand, and all over the ASEAN region. That Chinese population is probably the largest in the world outside of mainland China, much larger than you find in Europe or in North America. And they are very, they're very influential, they're very powerful. And as I was saying earlier to some of you people, that the Chinese community in Malaysia, for instance, is extremely integrated into the multicultural fabric of the Malaysian economy. They don't see themselves as mainland Chinese, but they see themselves as culturally, of course, Chinese. They have all the sort of what I call the sort of Confucianism sort of traits, work ethic, etc. And they're very much the backbone of the economy of Malaysia. And I've often wondered why Hong Kong doesn't pay more attention to ASEAN in terms of its relationships. In terms of the question about ASEAN and China, I first want to say I don't claim to be a great expert on all of these topics, but these are some of my observations, and some that I've shared in platforms in China in particularly about the relationship. At the moment, as we all know, much of the media information consumed by educated elites like us around China's role in the rest of the world is ironically actually created, curated in the Western world. I'll talk about why I think this is the big problem. And it's in fact a problem that we in Asia are responsible for, because we've neglected to build our own voices. And that neglect is, of course, rooted in the fact that we are subservient to Western narratives. Most of us, including me, until the last 10 years, was steeped in believing that if I heard something on Bloomberg or the BBC, it must be true, because we were colonized. We were colonized to believe that the Anglo-Saxon worldview is the correct worldview. And without getting too much into the current politics in Hong Kong, but a whole generation of young people post, and I speak as someone who's a permanent resident of Hong Kong, but it's not Chinese. I was amazed by how young Hong Kongers were so steeped in the belief that Western civilization was superior to everything else. And then, of course, during the protests in 2019, it came out so clear that a whole generation of young people had been hijacked to believe that they were not even Chinese, that they were actually something else. Although there is no harm in disagreeing with political systems, but they just rejected everything to do with who they are. I found this as a foreigner, and not as a foreigner, I'm a Hong Kong resident, but as a non-Chinese person who has, throughout my professional career, in Malaysia, I'm a minority of an Indian background. My parents are from India. And Malaysia's system is essentially institutionalized around race. And so institutional racism is part of it. But Malaysia's racism is very different from the racism I encountered when I was in Europe, etc. And then, of course, when I went to Africa, I understood more about what economic power looks like, why racism exists, why it is essentially systemic in the United States. It's essentially for economic gain. And in my new book, which came out last 2 months ago, which I would encourage everyone to try and get a copy without wanting to sell the book. It's the first book that argues that essentially white privilege is essentially embedded in the global system. It's embedded in everything that we as elites know, yet we have essentially accepted it. So I dissect that into 9 different spheres of the global world and talk about it. Of course, one is the media. So it comes back to what we understand. So most of what we understand about what's going on, say, between China and ASEAN is when we read The Economist, read the Financial Times, we need Reuters, we watch CNN. And as has been made very clear, but rather late for many people, belatedly, these are not unbiased media groups. We so long, those of us who were brought up in the Western education system, thought that these were accurate, that these were unbiased, they were independent, they were the free press. They were anything but the free press. And the Ukraine-Russian thing has, I think, exposed that lie in ways that had not been exposed before. I wrote a piece about it 2 weeks ago, which I'm happy for Brian to share with everyone if everyone's interested. So the ASEAN, the way ASEAN is viewed in the world, the ASEAN-China relationship, we need to take with a pinch of salt, but it's very difficult. So when I come back to Malaysia, and I go around ASEAN, many of the elites do believe that China is aggressive in ASEAN. I think China does have, and I've said this to Chinese policymakers when I've been invited to speak. Last year, I was invited to speak at the CCP 100th anniversary conference, the global one and the one that was held in Hong Kong. And my advice to China is, I think China has met too many people who are either totally opposed to China, and there's a lot of those, particularly in the Western world. And then there are many who feel they just have to support China and they have to say yes, yes, yes. Rather than a true friend of China or any countries to say, yes, but I know you got to do this better. So my speech, which I think is very encouraging because I was then invited by China Daily to turn it into an article, was China needs to be very careful. Because the perception in ASEAN is, mainly through the mass media, the Western mass media, is that China is aggressive, that South China Sea position is militaristic, is economic dominance, and China has no respect for smaller nations. And China has to do a lot of work to essentially counter this very prevailing media conveyed perception. So in fact, just 2-3 weeks ago, I was having a long debate with one of the leading editors of one of the editors of Malaysia's leading newspapers. He was convinced that China was trespassing into Malaysian waters and this and that, but he had no qualms, or he had not even thought about how many military bases the United States has in Southeast Asia, at least the ones we know. The ones we don't know, of course, that's a different story, right? But there was no balance. It comes back to my point that, you know, if the Western world has military presence, it must be for the greater good. If other countries, a rising power like China, has a military presence which is minuscule, then it must be aggression. It must be bad. So how did we get these kind of perceptions? Mainly is, of course, the battle that the Western media has won, and which we in Asia have absolutely dug our own grave by, not grave maybe, dug a hole by being negligent in not building our own. And at the moment, I talk all the time about the need for global media coming out of Asia to provide different perspectives. The money for this, of course, is very difficult to come because the Asian elites and the rich don't want to ever invest in this. But if you look at media in the United States, they are all led by business people who have political connections. And they understand the soft power. They understand soft power. And over the last 100 years, they have essentially built this immense, massive soft power through media, which captures minds. It's captured generations of us, and now the next generation, and so on. So this is so important to understand. So in ASEAN, I think at the political level, governments are much more informed about China, and they don't see China as the bad guy. They don't. But they are afraid, of course, because China is large. But public sentiment is quite interesting. Public sentiment in terms of both the public intellectuals, but just the average person who's a professional, reads English international media, they have a negative view of China. And this is quite widespread. And this needs to be countered by a couple of things. I think China needs to do a couple of things. And I've said this many times too, when I've spoken to Chinese platforms. China is so big that China can, when people say China is aggressive, they think that somehow there is the Politburo saying, do this and do that. They don't understand. This is a large country and there are many actors. There are many economic actors, a lot of large companies. And these people, as soon as they act in ways at times that are seen as not as soon as they act in ways that are not seen to be sitting within the understanding of what the global order looks like or the rules-based order, then China is bad. Many of these Chinese actors too are not informed. They don't understand how to behave and where the banana peels are being laid for them to slip. So China has a lot of work to do into making sure that its actors are actually very well informed because it's so big. Another example would be, and I said this at the big conference, and then I was asked to talk about it more in an article, where Chinese fishing fleets are essentially, extremely active off the east coast of Africa. And that's all you need for the Western media to say that China is raping the oceans in Africa and essentially depriving African people access to their resources. That's all you need. But I'm sure all the Chinese fleets operating off that east coast of Africa are not being directed by the Chinese Communist Party. It's just essentially open enterprise. But I think because of the geopolitics, I said that one thing China has the ability to do is when they see bad things, and if they agree it's not in their interest, they have an ability to act, unlike many others. I also believe that China has, because of its history, civilization, and because of its support for the liberation struggles around the world, has a much better understanding of the need for it to avoid becoming imperial. So I think in China, in Southeast Asia, the one road, one belt, and all of these things are important. But the question to ask are, what are the motives for China? I think this is important. What are the motives? There are many Chinese actors. Some of them are very clumsy. They essentially create a bad reputation for China because the Western media can't wait for any slip to essentially project China in a negative way. So China needs to be extremely careful, but in terms of the one road, one belt, one road initiative, etc., my view is there needs to be a recalibration, a rethink about what is this about, given what's happened in the last 3 years. Is it China's view that it is essentially doing this to help the developing world, which is the sort of original motives? And is it still that? And then it is to rein in the economic interests, because the economic interests will usually, after a while, overturn or derail the original motives of prosperity and creating development. I am encouraged that in the last year, of course, the Chinese government started talking about common prosperity. And I hope that common prosperity, and I get asked this a lot of times when I say, hey, China is the first country that has now started talking about common prosperity. And then the usual rebuttal is, yes, but in Africa, but in ASEAN, they are doing this and that. A lot of that is an exaggeration, but there's no running away from the fact that because China is so large, its impact, it cannot leave a light footprint. It'll always have a heavy footprint. And if it has actors who are not schooled in understanding the risk, then it will essentially open itself to massive criticism. And I think there's so much work to be done there to essentially enable China to make sure it stays within the course, but it's not simply driven by economic objectives. And that's a much larger question I would like to, happy to answer questions about in terms of, therefore, what I mean by the Asian century. So let me just stop there and just maybe perhaps say something about the Asian century. And then perhaps just a remark about the Ukraine-Russia thing and the implications. And start to talk about that a bit more. So the Asian century, about 10 years ago, I found myself in Honolulu, speaking at the APEC conference, and the second day of the APEC conference is usually when the ministers and presidents speak, and I was invited to speak. Don't ask me why. So the opening of the day started with that time it was Jiang Zemin was Xu Jintao was talking, and then after that they had Barack Obama spoke. Then the president of Indonesia spoke, and at that time Barack Obama mentioned that, if you all remember, the pivot to Asia. He talked about the United States pivoting towards Asia and all of those things. At that time, which was about 8, 9 years ago, there wasn't a view of what we now know, that China was a big threat. So they talked about the pivot to Asia, etc. And then I was asked to speak, and he spoke about the Asian century. And this is the point I'd like to make today for the discussion. And the point I made was, and this is everything about how we see the next 50 years, in my view, that we seem to project the future through the lens of the Western historical, economic, and political dimensions. That as apparently a conflict is inevitable between the United States and China, because some Greek philosopher said this about 10,000 years ago. Everything is through the lens of that canon of work of philosophy from the West. Everything should be seen through the strategic lens of Western scholarly thought. I think this is hocus pocus. And we buy into it and therefore reinforce that. These are not laws of physics. These are ideological reasonings, right? These are ideological. And so therefore we've created a world in which every time Henry Kissinger says something, it must be the word of God. As soon as some American president talks some stuff about stuff they don't even understand, it must be the truth. As soon as some American or British or European philosopher writes something, that's how it is. And we have no ways of countering it. Well, because we're subservient, we just buy it. We send our best school with kids to absorb all of this. We don't send them to study ancient philosophies from India, the Arab world, to China. We are not interested. So I think this way of thinking about the future, we need to create our own narrative for the 21st century. And for me, that narrative needs to be essentially rooted in the singular most important recognition. And that is, an Asian century molded around the concept of the American century or the British century will be catastrophic for the world. Because the British century was based on exploitation, extraction, and exceptionalism. It was called colonization, rape and plunder for about 300 years. The American century, which was not a century, but about 75 years, and then continuing, and now in some kind of decay, was based on exceptionalism. We will bomb anybody, we will sanction you, we will use the exorbitant privilege of the dollar to dictate what is right and wrong, and we will punish anybody who doesn't believe, and create a narrative around a global order, a rules-based, which has no rules actually, except a set of conditions that perpetuate Western economic power led by the United States. So at that point, I want to just make clear, when you say these things, people think you're anti-American or anti-Western, not at all. I have many good American friends. I would hate to see an America that is weak. That is not in anyone's interest. But we can't have an America and a Europe that continues to behave as though it's the 18th century with technology, 18th century with satellites, 18th century with nuclear bombs. We can't. We have to change it. And therefore the 21st century has to be one in which China at this point, could be with India, must relook what does development look like, what does economic prosperity look like, and not think about the Asian century in which we Asians are number one, and now is our time. I think that is regressive, that is backward looking, and that is in denial of the world we live in. The world we live in today is one in which there's resource constraints. There's not enough for everyone. There are going to be 10 billion people. 6 billion of them will live in Asia, not in the United States. 6 billion Asians, of which almost half will be Chinese and Indians, will need to live together. And we cannot and should not imagine that we can have economic models and economic aspirations built around the American dream, because that will be catastrophic. The laws of physics and thermodynamics are very clear. We all cannot have that dream. Yet we have been schooled that we think the good life is in the United States. It might be if you just think about yourself, and there's no denying that most of us live our lives like that way. But when we think about the world, we have to understand that the majority of Chinese, Indians, Africans, etc., will not be able to live lives taken for granted by the average European or American. It's simply not possible. The science is very clear. Yet the Western economic model is in denial of all of this, because it's based on exceptionalism and it has dominated the world. So the Asian century, in my view, has to be one that rejects those economic models, rejects the governance systems that have been ideologically aligned to those models, and understands that new governance models will be needed. In my second book, I allude to what these governance models need to be, and therefore I talk about the state. The state is essentially being the one that writes the rules. It has partners in the private sector, but all that business school and hocus pocus, in my view, from the North American business schools in particular, around free markets, etc., we have to re-question. And I think the Chinese are beginning to question that. In Asia, I think we begin to understand. So let me finish by saying that the Asian century cannot be one in which we emulate and ape Western ideas, ideological ideas around economics, governance systems, prosperity, freedoms, and rights. And I'll just cut into one of those and then stop there. So, you know, if you go into America and talk about, for instance, things to do with now, let's say the existential threats of carbon and climate change, which in Hong Kong, sadly, we don't seem to have aim and prioritize, and that is a problem within Hong Kong. The idea that an American president, and they all talk about climate change, but everything is within the framework of the existing archaic, out of fashion economic model, which is based on extraction and externalizing costs. when they talk about it, it's just another economic reframing rather than changing people's expectations on way of life, right? Way of life. That I think is rooted more and has a better chance in ancient cultures, Chinese civilization, Muslim civilization, Hindu civilization. Christianity had it, but they'll have to fight how powerful modernity is essentially inflicted this know-how of privilege, this sense of privilege into advanced Western democratic societies. So we'll have to decide how it is, what are our rights and privilege, what can you have? Car ownership was not a human right in the 21st century. You don't have to be a rocket scientist to know we can't all have cars. It cannot be the engine for growth, for the industrialization. But if you go to the United States and tell people you can't have a car, they take their guns out. And of course, you can't tell them you can't have a gun. That's almost an oxymoron, if you see what I mean. So that's where I think we have a new narrative. I think China can be very much part of that narrative. And that conflict with the United States and ASEAN, or United States and Europe at the moment, is that fear in the Western world, that 400 years of dominance, a sort of blanket sort of indoctrination around privilege is coming to a halt. And for the first time, one civilization is standing up to it. I'm not saying China is perfect, but it's very difficult for the West to accept a non-Caucasian civilization being its equal. And that is the root of racism. So I often argue that American and European foreign policy is essentially rooted in racism, the inability to accept the rights of others and the equality of others. The Chinese are facing it now, but they're strong enough. In the 1970s and 80s, when Japan became strong, basically Japan was castrated, but Japan is small. So my final point about this, and then take some questions, is that some of my Indian friends then think that I am pro-China. Looking like me, why would I just be pro-China? I'm just interested in outcomes and looking at systems in relation to my understanding of what the existential threats are of the world we live in. Most people do not understand the nature of the existential threats facing us. The pandemic is just a little warning that human beings in pursuit of unlimited economic growth have trampled on natural systems in ways that cannot be tolerated. So trampled meaning we thought we could go anywhere. We can't go anywhere now, just like that. So we will have to redesign how the world looks like, and that's the conflict. So my Indian friends say, you're pro-China. No, I said, I'm looking at systems that allow us to navigate a very complex 21st century. And I tell my Indian friends, when you guys get your act together and you become powerful, they will be after you too. And cheekily, I said that, but you might not get your act together because you have a parliamentary democracy that is not suited to the Indian civilization and the challenges of its time. I don't think parliamentary democracy in India can solve the problems of a nation that will have 1.5 billion people. No way. So let me stop there and just leave that, and I'm happy to take any questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Chandran. This is a very very good insight on the how the West shape our world and what would happen after that. And I would like to take questions from audience. I'll give you some minutes to think about it, but at the meantime, I'll have Leo's question, because I see Leo has a question on the chat room. His question is, the implementation of PRC's national security law in Hong Kong has been criticized by some as ending the unique status and individual freedom of Hong Kong under the one country, two system policy. Hong Kong is perceived by some as under direct control of the mainland. two UK courts of final appeal judges have just resigned. What is your view on it? And has Hong Kong lost its global recognition as a capitalist city separate from PRC?
For me, this is the inevitable shift. There's a lot there, and I don't want to pretend to be a scholar of the one country, two systems and all of that. But most of what you've said are perceptions, right? And these are not rules of law or physics, etc. Yeah, so just like markets, people say if you do this, well, the perception is that the markets will collapse, etc. So my view is that it is a test for Hong Kong. But let's be very clear, Hong Kong is essentially the sovereign state is China, and people need to get used to this. The sovereign state is China. So the one country, two systems, I'm not a scholar of the one country, two systems, does not in any way suggest, from what I understand, that the sovereign state cannot act in the interest of Hong Kong. And we know why it acted, because it didn't have the security laws. In that instance, two judges left. Can I be flippant and say, who cares? That is the change that will happen. Decolonization is very difficult. Decolonization requires shifts. Many of us want the old colonial powers to continue. The work we have to do is to make sure what we want. We want Hong Kong to be fair. We want Hong Kong to have rule of law. We must hold our leaders accountable to that, but we don't need judges with strange headgear to be the symbols of what is right and wrong. If we do, we seem to have said, we don't know, only these guys can tell us. And I'm not going to dismiss those things, but I think this is inevitable. Decolonization does require this, and I don't think it's a problem at all. Question is, do Hong Kong people come together and say, we will hold ourselves accountable to the rule of law? And I, for one, don't think China has any interest in making Hong Kong some lawless, maverick state where anybody can cheat and there's no court of arbitration of anything like that. Why would China want to do that? And the fact that those two judges can be replaced by two Chinese judges, why not? Are we saying that China has no history of judicial, maybe not common law, but law is interpreted in different ways, And I remember spending some time with Aboriginal people in Australia who had rules of law, but they were seen as natives. The Native Americans have rule of law, very deep, rooted in thousands of years of civilization. They were seen as irrelevant. Tibetans have rules of law that goes back in thousands of books. So we should not hold ourselves to one terms of reference. It's up to the people of Hong Kong and the good minds of people of Hong Kong to say, okay, we don't want to have a lousy place where it's all corrupt. We want this, but not the only route to it is not through guys wearing strange wigs. You can do it in different ways. So I'm not worried about this at all. But I do know that there will be negative press. We just have to weather it, but we need to know, what do we want? And people like me, I've got no power, but I feel, hey, rule of law in Hong Kong works. The only thing that doesn't work in Hong Kong is if you want to take down the government and throw a petrol bomb at someone. That doesn't work in most countries.
Okay, another question about one country, two system. Questions from, how do you see the idea of one country, two system as an ingenious attempt for human civilization to see a way of resolving ideological confrontation in the long run from big historical perspective?
Again, there are people much more qualified than me who study this to depth. I do think, from what I know and what I've observed, that it was a very, very good and smart way. In my view, to this day, China has more or less, and I'm not an apologist for China, I think China has played a fair hand. In most other places, they could have done a lot of different things. So I think China played a fair hand. I think it's up to the role of Hong Kong people and the government not to essentially be yes men to China. I think this is a big problem that so many of our leaders feel somehow, and it comes, I think, from a kind of feudal Confucianist society, that they need to say yes to Big Brother rather than, hey, I don't think we can work it this way. So I do think that it was a fairly ingenious way of doing that. I think what is even more important, and that's why I want to look forward, we're so stuck in this basic law and one country, two systems, because we want to retain something old. But as I said, the world has changed, that the old is out, the new is in. And the new is not understood by everybody. The new is that you will need to redefine how Hong Kong is even going to prosper in the 21st century as part of just a greater China. And the main areas there is, if you look at Hong Kong, I'm just going to make the stark comparison. Hong Kong imports 95% of its food. The new future is one in which you cannot simply believe you can just buy in food because you're a financial center. You're going to have to produce some of your own food. You're going to be part of a larger ecosystem of food production. In China already, one of the biggest concerns of risk is food security. If the pandemic has taught us anything, it's food security. Around Asia, I go around saying food security first. Forget FDI and all these old economic rationales and obsessions with digital and this. The first thing you're going to have to do is essentially provide security. Security comes first from food. And in fact, my organization for Malaysia is writing a report around reframing the economy around the existential threats of food security. So Hong Kong, I have argued in our programs, and I know someone's asked a question about our leadership programs. Last year, if you're interested, I'll get my colleagues to send it. I've said that Hong Kong should set a target that by 2030, it would produce 30% of its own food. That would be revolutionary. But Hong Kong people don't think this way. Guess who has thought about it? Singapore. Singapore is seeing existential threats way beyond, planning way ahead. And if Singapore can say 30% by 2030, what is Hong Kong doing? Hong Kong is of the view that somehow it will be this financial hub, and somehow it will just get food from somewhere else, and will buy things in cans and imports. That view of the world is quite a naive one. So I'm not suggesting that an urban center like Hong Kong should grow all its food, but there needs to be a level of independence and a trajectory towards. And the proof in the pudding is that Singapore has said now by 2030, 30% of food grown in Singapore. It will reframe the economy. So I think those are the things that we need to think about, the sort of the big ideas. And I think the big idea coming out of China is the common prosperity one. And Hong Kong needs to do that. But in the one country, two systems, does Hong Kong just want to be this financial center and hub forever? It's an old kind of way of looking at the world.
Thank you. One more question about Hong Kong, then we go to ASEAN. Mr. Nair, what drives you to organize a program for Hong Kong young people to stay in Hong Kong?
Oh, what drives me? Well, it started about 5 years ago. I was in Europe speaking to a lot of young students. And in that group, there were many, quite a few Africans, Asians, and Japanese, Chinese. They were all in Europe. And then several of the Africans and others said to me that they found it very difficult to live in Europe because of discrimination, racism, etc. And I said to them, you have no free right to no racism. What do you expect? You expect these people to just treat you well? They don't. Their history is not embedded in all of that. And even if things have changed and social norms have changed, why do you expect that they should have a right to treat you well? And I said to them, someone said they don't spend efforts for food production. Yeah, we can talk about it. Hong Kong is part of China. Agreed. And yeah, that's why the integration is important. But the point I wanted to make there is that I told the young African guys and Chinese, you're educated and privileged. What are you doing in Europe? You actually owe an obligation to go back to your country. Many Asians and Africans are very happy to be second-class citizens in the Western world, but they don't want imperfections where they are. Their view is where they are needs to ape the Western world. If it's not like that, well, I'll go to the Western world and then I'll be a second-class citizen. As many have found out in the epidemic, where people of Chinese people of Chinese origins have been discriminated, violence, etc. in the United States, Europe, etc. But they don't want to be in their own country. So my view was, if you're educated and privileged, what the hell are you doing running away? You have an obligation to stay in your country and build it. Nations are not built by refugees. Nations are built by people who come, stay. Over time, we all travel, but we stay. So my motivation was to actually help these young Hong Kong people to understand that the grass is not greener elsewhere, that the grass is actually not so good elsewhere. And I know even a couple of my friends who've gone, taken their kids to the UK, to some godforsaken little town, and realized the weather is terrible, the food is bad, and life is lonely. But the utopia that they're going to some freedom was so easy to sell. So I want to kind of convince them, hey, this is your country, you're educated, you have a responsibility. People build nations through taking responsibility of the future. And there are jobs to be created, new industries to be created, etc. So that's the motivation. Can I just answer the quick question about, the food thing?
Yeah.
I'm not suggesting, but that is also, I'm not suggesting Hong Kong must produce all its food. I'm saying it must have a little target. Because if Singapore can see the vision, go and talk to the Singaporeans and understand. Of course, Hong Kong is part of Greater China. Well, let's get integrated then. But let's also remember that the Greater Bay Area is also going to have an explosion of population. And you keep buying your food is not the same way to do it. But you have to create new industries. So one of the things we do with the Stay and Build is to tell Hong Kong people, but government policy is important. There are whole new industries to be created. And one, for me, is food, right? Getting young people into the food. The science, the data, it's all clear. We can produce food. What prevents us from doing that? And we're not talking 80%, I'm just talking 25, 30%, all of that. You create new industries rather than going around this rabbit hole of Hong Kong being a financial center and where real estate prices are exorbitant. I mean, that cannot be the future of the city unless we want all the weaker, poorer people to migrate. We have to create.
So I agree that diversity is good. Hong Kong is so focused on finance, but we need more diversity.
Yes.
And before we go to ASEAN, I let Ms. Choi So-Yok, former Legislative Council member, to speak.
Hello,
Hi.
Chandran.
Hi,
Chandran. This is So-Yok. Remember the days when we were serving together at the Sustainable Development Council with
remember
with Edgar.
Yes.
Yes. Good to hear from you again.
Good to
First
see
of
you.
all, thank you. And let me just turn myself a little bit to let you see me now. Okay.
Yes.
Okay. Now, I first of all, I concur with you 100% with what you have just said in the past hour, and really it's very insightful. But one thing I would just like to hear more from you is what would you think Hong Kong at this stage could do to kind of amalgamate or integrate with the with ASEAN countries? I agree with you 100%. And actually, that has been in my mind for all the past years, that we have neglected ASEAN countries for too long. So at this point, what would you suggest, apart from, as you said, financial center, what would you suggest that Hong Kong should do in order to actively integrate together with the ASEAN countries?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Chosiok. You look younger.
You're kidding. This is the only one thing I don't agree with you, Chandran.
Okay, this is the one thing you must agree with me. Okay, but this is an important point because and I don't want to get into the politics of the the government policies, and we all can argue about that. But there's just simply not enough foresight. So all the obsession was with China, 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 right? But then we found out there's a whole generation who said, we're not Chinese, we hate China. This is really strange. So it was just a simple economic sort of China, 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 without looking at the world, one country, two systems, independently, because the political leaders and the economics and the business people are one-dimensional. I've often said that Hong Kong has great business leaders, but very few politicians and very few community leaders, and that's a tragedy. So what should we do? I have, in fact, even said to the government going back 10 years ago, invest money in Southeast Asia, whereby young Hong Kong people can essentially go and study, live, and work to find things, to do things. I'll give you some examples. Science and Technology Park. Instead of building billions of dollars of essentially hardware, with the software is not good enough, and hoping that Hong Kong will become some IT hub, imagine if Hong Kong sent every year thousands of people to essentially Myanmar, Cambodia, and other parts to essentially understand what the development needs are. So most of our kids are being told, I mean, we know that the education system in Hong Kong is world-class at rote learning and producing lawyers, doctors, and engineers and accountants. We know that. But if you want something more creative, you need to go out to the world. And so you have all the science and technology innovations and buildings around which market? These kids don't even know Greater Bay. So they're all doing little apps to deliver food in Central and do small time things. So they don't have a worldview. So I think to create that and to answer your question, John, I think Hong Kong should have at the highest levels policies of working together with Chinese companies, but independently also establishing institutional networks across Southeast Asia among some of the largest populations, Vietnam, Myanmar. What is Hong Kong good at? Service industry, project management, etc. But also bringing its capital and its resources to expose young Hong Kongers to that world so that they can create, using the strengths of Hong Kong, new industries that will benefit Hong Kong. So I argue that, build the next science and technology park in Myanmar, Hong Kong investment, build a Hong Kong type management school in these different places, but send Hong Kong students out, send them to ASEAN, and rather than Stanford or MIT, if I can put it.
Can I also make a suggestion that has been in my mind for quite a while? I thought Hong Kong should also go out to students from ASEAN countries. I mean, we have those 10% quota for overseas students. Many of them, most of those quota are now used for Chinese students. Of course, we welcome more Chinese, but I think we should increase that 10% to a higher percentage, of which a high proportion would go to ASEAN countries. I believe many of the parents from the ASEAN countries would love to send their children to Hong Kong, not only for education, but also for knowing China and in the future, of course. So, yeah. Yes, sure. Okay, sorry, back to you.
No, sorry. So what I meant is that should obviously be done. But you know, the problem is Hong Kong is an expensive place. So that unless they are fully subsidized and given scholarships, very few from ASEAN can come and live in Hong Kong. It's almost impossible. So the only ones who come are elites. And the elites rather go to the United States or somewhere else, right? So mainland Chinese come. But your point is exactly right. Why don't we create these scholarships for tens of thousands of ASEAN students to come? I have even felt that Hong Kong should build, rather than building another business school, another Anglo-Saxon private school, and giving land away to Chicago Booth and all of these people, this old world economics, and teaching them nonsense. Why don't Hong Kong build a Hong Kong ASEAN Global University, right? Which would bring Chinese civilization from both ASEAN, mainland China. These are the kind of ideas where we'll be teaching both literature, science, traditional medicine, architecture, agricultural practices, and all that. That is not in the DNA of the last 2 decades of Hong Kong policymakers. It was all about making a dime, not thinking about the software. And you know, I often say, Jack Ma could only have been created in China because he had suffered poverty and saw everything. And he saw a big problem to solve. Young Hong Kong people don't see those problems because they live, and even if they come from the lower rung, they live in a very confined, narrow world. Their whole education system is geared towards, can I become a lawyer so that I can buy a 30,000 flat? Can I rent something for 30,000? So it's all geared towards something very peculiar. It's not geared towards ambition and creativity, right? And that is Hong Kong's problem. So we should build an ASEAN Hong Kong Global University. And that's, I think, how Hong Kong should integrate. And I bet you the ASEAN governments would be the first to say, please, let's do this. And there is many ways that you can get their involvement in kind. So thank you, Judge Yok, for that great suggestion.
Yeah, thank you. And there's another question from the audience related to this topic. What do you think about the young people in ASEAN to think about China, and do you think that they are attracted to study and work in China? And how extent is the use of Putonghua in Asian countries?
Putonghua is widely spoken in many parts of in Southeast Asia. I mean, in Malaysia, it's widely spoken. In Malaysia, interestingly, it's even spoken by Malays. The other day, I was at a medical center. I met a young Malay girl, Muslim girl. She was dressed in the traditional hijab. She spoke Putonghua, right? So I think that's one of the reasons Chinese companies like to come to ASEAN, because they can actually find support. If they go to Africa, it's quite difficult, but they do. But here they find always Chinese who can speak, etc. So I think young ASEAN people see China as an opportunity. Is a sort of a thing that they are very interested in. But China seems so far for most. So the only ones who can see China as near are the elites, right? Elites, and then they go to Hong Kong, etc. But I believe already China is trying to open the doors to ASEAN to move. But why don't Hong Kong become that gateway, rather than just a gateway for, you know, capital, a gateway for young people to find out, right? Transition, etc. And this idea of that university, that campus, etc. That's what we should do. Become a real conduit for these things. And so young people have a very positive view of China, but it's so far. It's just too far for them. And I'm not talking about elites who can travel. You know, the majority of them are lower middle income people, but they want to go to China because they hear the stories. And as you and I will know, one of the best things for Chinese soft power is for people to go and visit. So I'm always telling people, there's only 2 countries worth visiting if you're young and you want to understand the world. China and India. It's no point going to Switzerland. You will learn nothing. But people want to always go and have these holidays. But if you go to China and India, I always encourage Chinese students to go and study in India too. And I always tell Indians to go to China and study, because then we create better mutual understanding. And we break away from this idea that education can only be found in the Ivy League schools and the elite schools of the West. And we need to break away from that idea. So young people in this part of the world really interested. Many of them can't afford it. And I think China and Hong Kong can be part of attracting them. And Hong Kong could be very much part of that sort of conduit.
Dr. Kuan.
Sorry, I have quite a number of friends in Malaysia and Indonesia because I was working in the Hong Kong University for the last 40 years. But many of them told me some of the sad story in the early century. Could you comment on the future of this that China is going to deal with these 2 countries in the future, say at least 10 years? Because China, Indonesia damaged Chinese quite a lot.
Yes. Yeah. So the history of the Chinese persecution in Indonesia is well documented. There's several very good books. One recent one, which I'm happy to share with you. But even in the 60s, the persecution one, you will know that the CIA was also involved in it. I'm not going to blame it all on the CIA, but it was essentially part of geopolitics. So you're right, Doctor, that there was persecution of Chinese on a large scale, particularly in Indonesia. Many hundreds of thousands died. The future, I think, in Indonesia looks very good. In my view, today, President Jokowi is essentially probably the best leader in the world. But because he's Indonesian, he's a Muslim, he's not from Europe, the European and Western world is completely oblivious. They don't even know who this guy is. But he's probably the most enlightened leader anywhere in the world. He is dearly loved by people. He is loved by both sides as their president. He's so enlightened. So he, for me, exemplifies the future of Indonesia, where there was all this nasty things done against Chinese people, but they have moved on. He has built reconciliation, and not he only. I think the last few presidents since then, even Suharto. So the Chinese have integrated. As you know, all the great Indonesian badminton players were actually Chinese origins, Rudy Hartono and all of these guys. But today there isn't that sense that I'm Chinese, I'm Indonesian, because they took on Indonesian names, as you know, which was also part of that particular political movement then. So I think those things happened, but I think Indonesia has a principle of nation building called the Pancasila, which you probably know. We can send it. And this is a abiding philosophy. But I think Jokowi has exemplified it through the leadership. And I think Indonesia's future is very, very bright. It's very bright in terms of that. In terms of the Malaysian system, where there's the other large Chinese community, you know there's a large Chinese community in Thailand, particularly in Bangkok, but they also took on Thai names. There wasn't the persecution on the scale, but they converted, and the Thais did a very good thing through Buddhism, etc. They all took Thai names. But in Malaysia, it's very different too. And Malaysia is one of the few places, apart from Singapore, which is majority Chinese. In Malaysia, the Chinese retained their names. There was never a large persecution of Chinese in terms of massacres or anything like that. There was one conflict in 1969, May 13th, in which a couple of thousand people of both races died. It's never happened. So Malaysia's credit is peace, And most people all live together. I live in China. I always say I was born in a Hindu household. I went to a missionary school, and they told me that God was a white guy called Jesus Christ. I prayed to Hindu gods at 7 a.m., went to school at 8 p.m., 8 a.m. They told me to pray to Jesus Christ. I was very open-minded. I prayed to Jesus Christ too. And they told me he was a white guy. I was okay. And then I came home and I lived next to the mosque. Until today, the call for prayer is a very spiritual call for me, though I was born a Hindu, Islamic. So when I see Muslims, I see my brothers. I don't see them as aliens in Malaysia. And of course, at 6 p.m., I went to eat char siu bao at the stalls. As an Indian in a Hindu household, I learned to eat with chopsticks at the age of 3. And Chinese food is part of my diet. My mother, who came from India, in Malaysia, coming back to the fusion, we could never have a meal at home, even with Indian food, without a Chinese dish. And my mother came from India and cooked Chinese food. So, so Malaysia is very different. But the institutional racism, which I've written a lot recently, which I'm fighting, the institutional racism is different. It's elite Malays essentially seeking to create a rent-seeking privilege for themselves using race and religion. So they're no different from the white supremacists in the United States who use white privilege to essentially control the economy, but use the lower income white people as their allies to essentially, keep others away, be it Chinese or blacks. So I think the future for race relations and integration in ASEAN is good, is very good. I think people have moved beyond. Malaysia is one, but it's not violent, it's not nasty in that sense. It's discriminatory. And when I started talking about this in the last few months, I've had various foreign embassies, because my articles appear in the newspapers. Very few Malaysians write about this because they are scared and sensitive. I write, no one's put me in jail. And I try and be constructive. Various foreign embassies have approached me for support, and I reject all of them. I said, this is our problem. We can solve it. We don't need you, nor do we need your judges. We must build that future. And this over-reliance on Western sort of moral standing to camouflage other things, we need to reject. We need to do it ourselves. So I see the future of that in ASEAN as being good. And I think we'll have many more wise leaders.
Yeah, thank you. I'll have another question about culture, then we move on to foreign affairs. Chandran you have mentioned about a lot about soft power, about the media, Western media.
When we go.
About media and soft power, then I would like to ask, how do you think we can, ASEAN or China, to increase its soft power or the voice out to the world?
Well, firstly, we need to free ourselves of the inferiority complex. We need to essentially not be subservient. Somehow our cultural traits have essentially been an ally of the ability of Western imperialism to subjugate us. So we need to, but it's natural if you've been 400 years colonized, that you would only see certain things as that. We were told in the early days when I was a young boy that the only beautiful women were white women like Marilyn Monroe. That was a propaganda of Hollywood, The good guys were the cowboys, not the native Indians, who we know historically were the, so it's all the propaganda. So you have to be, so now we have to have more outspoken. I would argue, and it might seem controversial, most of our elites, even to this day, and particularly in Hong Kong, but I think that has changed in the last 2 years, are subservient and seek legitimacy through association with Western institutions. I'm not saying they need to reject it, but they hardly speak up. And I know many You say, Chandran, thanks for speaking. I said, why don't you speak? You got more power, more money, and whatever. But they dare not, because the legitimacy, and that's the power of the West. If you want to send your son to Harvard Business School, well, you want to be on the board, well, you can't call it the Flat Earth Society. In terms of what I see it, as the business models are broken. So we don't have that boldness. So to change this, first we need to recognize we're subservient. We have begun to recognize that the Western media is essentially not free, it is not unbiased, and it's very prejudiced. And it's in fact, even in my view, racist, right? So then what we have to do is we have to build the soft power. And at the moment, for those of you who are interested, for about 8 years, I've been trying to say we need to build media platforms in Asia that are independent, but not run around journalism sort of dictates of the West. Journalism dictates in the West are that you be controversial, you speak truth to power, and then you're a superhero. Well, those are traditions in the West that are valued. I'm not saying they're wrong. But in not all countries do you need to speak truth to power in ways that antagonize. So we can have different ways. We can have the Asian ways. You can have the Chinese way, all cultures. But we don't do this. So in fact, so I've been trying to create, because of the availability of modern technology, you don't have to have a large newspaper today to be powerful. You can create a media digital platform. So I've been trying to create one, but guess what? You can't get Asian investors, but they'll be ready to put money into some Australian, British, or American thing, but they won't put it into something Asian, which is going to confront this with first-class journalism, unbiased, global viewpoints, but seen from a different lens, right? So at the moment, I'm trying to raise some money for that, and for me, it's been interesting since the riots in Hong Kong. And the waking up of people who thought that the Western media was unbiased and found out it's totally biased and it's in cahoots with governments to portray Hong Kong in this way and bias. There has been some interest in this, but I think we need 10. We need 10, and it's not just from Hong Kong, but Asians don't do this. And as long as we don't do that, we'll be victims of this subjugation of media onslaught about what is right and wrong. And when we do this, then we create a different platform. And it's not about Asia is right. So anyone is interested in the prospectus of this platform, I'm trying to seek investors for, I'd be happy to share that. In fact, I'll send it to you, Brian, and then you can share it.
Yes, good.
And it's not about $100 million. It's small money, but Asians are scared. Our elites are scared. And that's the difference. You look at in the West, they understand the power of media. Where did Jeff Bezos put some of his money? Where do all of these guys put media?
Yeah, one more question about, is there any chance for China to unite with the Asian partners to build a soft power, first starting within the local region?
I think there's always that. I'm in touch with some people in China about how China is perceived in the international media. So I've been approached to kind of maybe, provide some insights. I think, as you know, in mainland China, they don't understand PR. Now that was an invention of the Americans.
The Chinese PR is very bad. Very bad.
Yeah, so I've told my Chinese counterparts, your PR is bad. It's so clumsy. But partly it's because China doesn't play PR. China plays facts, do this, do this, do this. And this is what we do. These are the results. Science, facts, results, right? So they're kind of tone deaf to this nonsense, which in a way is good because they're not subservient to, oh, you want to. But they now realize that they have to do some. So I think before China partners everybody else, it needs to get its own stories out, and do it in an honest and legitimate way. So for instance, Brian, can you remind me? I'm a member of something called the Club of Rome, which you mentioned. We established the Club of Rome China about 2 years ago, and we produced the first report late last year, which is the first of its called Understanding China. And the point was to get, and this will go globally to many of the global organizations, and young Brian, who's on this call, who's here, you all know Brian, of course, everyone knows Brian, the other Brian too, helped me with putting that report together. But as we were putting that report together, it was clear nothing of this sort existed, nothing. So we're trying to make sure, I think China needs to do a very good job of getting things more understood, getting independent scholars, but not doing the, we are China, we are right, and nobody should tell us, and it's just propaganda. That's the way the soft power. The problem for the United States and the West in the last few years has been, as they felt threatened, their soft power has actually weakened, but they're putting more gasoline into the tank because their soft power has been weakened because of the lack of credibility, because of the lies, and people have found out. People have found out. So I think those are the kinds of things China should first do for itself, but it carve a new path, which is not the old way, and it should get advisors who are their friends to tell them the truth, and then form partnerships with others.
Yeah, thank you. I'll move on to the final topic of foreign affairs, because we're running out of time. We still have 10 minutes for you.
Yes.
Yes. Okay. 10 minutes. We will talk about more about foreign affairs. We all know that China and ASEAN has set up RCEP very recently. What do you think about the economic developments in the future, and do you think on RCEP?
Earlier I alluded to the fact that these regional economic sort of creations, I think, is part of the old world, creating large economic cooperative units, etc. I think we need to create more large regional peace and development pacts, because it's development that we want. It's a larger discussion I can't go into, but that doesn't mean I'm saying that economies are not important. But I fear that China and the rest of Asia is just following the development track of pursuit of economic growth at all costs, at all archaic economic models of markets and free trade that is destructive. And that's what within China today, China is talking about common prosperity. Well, common prosperity needs to be integrated into things like RCEP and things like that, because common prosperity would change the entire way of economic thinking. So about last year, early this year, I was fortunate enough to be invited to do a talk at a international forum organized by the Chinese Academy for Social Science. It was attended by the president and various other people. And there was a lot of talk about this. My talk was simply the same thing, that we in the Asia Pacific, led by China at the moment, need to really rethink what the next 50 years will look like. If we pursue economic growth through this belief that we can have cheap extraction of resources, externalize costs, and continue to promote relentless consumption, we will destroy everything. The evidence is clear. The evidence is clear. So we have to have a departure from this. The Chinese with common prosperity beginning to understand this within their country, right? So for me, RCEP and all of these are archaic old models of the last century. The new century is actually peace and development. And therefore, what does an economy look like? And I'm about to hopefully write a piece by saying, and when I spoke at that Chinese Academy of Social Science, I finished off by asking everyone, so what is the point of an economy? And I was very pleased when one of the leading scholars from the Chinese Academy for Social Science said, I think Mr. Nair asked the most important question. So what is the point of an economy? The point of an economy is not to be a global financial center. That's Hong Kong. The point of an economy is not to create a stock market that is volatile and going up and down. The point of an economy is not to create and measure how many billionaires you have. These are all subsets of essentially either indices that are distortions of what you think is important, or mechanisms that create the type of distortions you desire. But the point of an economy really, in the most fundamental sense, is to create a distribution of resources in ways that you do not create inequalities that result in majority of people living in drudgery, unhappiness, and with anguish. That's the point of the economy. Be it the Indian situation, the African situation. But what happened in the last 60, 70 years, the Anglo-Saxon American model was, and they perfected it to say, you just grow, and you grow larger, they trickle down, the economics, everyone will rise with the tide, you know, all the trickle down economic theories. But what have we seen? Even in Hong Kong, we've seen the perversion of that, which resulted in essentially 60% of the population living in standard quality of life, which is a disgrace for a city with our GDP. It's not an economy. It is essentially an elite economy for some. And the continuous belief that that's the only way to run an economy is, I think, 20th century. It's old, it's colonial. We need to do different things. So I think from China's point of view, for me, would be to lead a new kind of global economy within the Asian region for the Asian century, which is more about peace and development around resource constraints and how do we live within that. And that wealth measurement is not based on simply the old things. That doesn't mean I'm saying we don't need to produce things, we don't need to do that. But everything is about what is the ultimate objective. So I am of the view that all of those old things are part and parcel of the problems we have, and we need to move to a new construct of regional cooperation, of sharing essentially resources and understanding that, I think in China they understand. In my first book I wrote about this. You know, most people overseas think all Chinese are rich. You all know this, right? They think all the Chinese are rich, and they don't understand that the vast majority of Chinese are still poor. But the state has functioned in the way they've taken away the drudgery of life. They've given them a home. They've given them electricity. They've given them water. And for me, that's why I say the Chinese system works. And then people say, oh, you're a communist. I said, no, I'm just looking at the systems. I've done work in India. And the Indian system doesn't work because it has not been able to deliver people from the drudgery of life. Malnutrition, food, water, sanitation, housing, electricity, healthcare. So the state's obligation is that. And that's what China and the rest of the world should think about when we now talk about economics. Development for what purpose? And with 10 billion people, we are going to have such great social pressures that the only way to reduce them is to provide people with what I call the basic rights to life. And in Hong Kong, the tensions will not recede until we ensure that the bottom 60% have a decent home. And it's not 300 square foot and $500,000.
Well, one last question about the South China Sea, because ASEAN and China has some countries in ASEAN has come conflict with China over the sovereignty of South China Sea. Would that hinder the relationship between China and Asian countries and affect their cooperations in culture and economy?
In my view, you know, for 10 years at least, the South China Sea 9-dot line issue is coming back and forth. In my view, at some of the forums I've been to, most Asian, ASEAN, particularly ASEAN diplomats and governments know that there will be no conflict, open conflict with China. Partly because they don't want it, partly because they know China doesn't want it to. I think we need to be sure that we remind China of the dangers of China becoming too strong and some belligerent sectors within China trying to show their clout. But as long as China has wise leadership, I don't think there will be conflict. There are people in the Western world and media who love to see conflict in ASEAN on the South China Sea. I don't think that's going to happen. I think all the ASEAN countries have many powerful Chinese business leaders who all have access to Beijing, etc. And therein lies that ability to solve these problems without wars. But I do think China is so big that it must control some of its actors, marine vessels, etc., which transgress into waters, and make sure that these don't happen. So I think the Western media will continue to portray China as a threat in the South China Sea. I think the media will continue to influence young people in Asia that China is the threat, but I think the governments know better. But it's all up to China to make sure, because it's as big as it is, that it behaves impeccably. And my advice always, where I have a chance, is to ask China to bend over backwards to accommodate the smaller people. And I think the Chinese understand that from a philosophical point of view. And we need to remind them, you have an obligation to the weaker. After all, their struggle was that of the weak against the powerful. And they need to be reminded of that. So I'm not worried about South China Sea that much, actually. But China must be careful that it does not, even through legitimate means, take a disproportionate amount of the resources from ASEAN too. Because ASEAN's population is now about 700 million people and could be about 1 billion. They need the resources too. So that's the thing about the common prosperity thing that I say to China, you got to practice it globally. You can't say we have common prosperity at home, but on the other hand, we will be reaching out and taking resources from Africa, ASEAN. That would be a very bad way of looking at it. So that comes back to my point about what the regional compacts and regional development needs to look like. It cannot be in that free market trade where winner takes all kind of mentality.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you, Chandran, for your perspective. It's very good from the cultural perspective and the idea of development. It's very, I'll say, very distinctive and very good, really great. And I would like to, can I have your report of the Rome Club report?
Yes.
Yes, because some of our members would like to have it. So
yes.
Have a look.
Yes,
and
I will put together.
Yeah. Go on. Sorry, go on.
No, I'll put together that and a couple of other things that I think will be of interest to members and send that off to you on Monday. And I hope this was of some interest to everybody.
Good, very good. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Please share my email. People have asked for my email. Please share my email to everyone, no problem. And please, please support when we do the leadership program in Hong Kong for young people. Support people, and you all have networks. I mean, that's really what we're trying to do.
No, thank you, Chandran. And I have to say sorry to other audience because there are lots of questions, and I'm sorry that I do not have much time to complete it. But if you have any other question with Chandran, you can send the question privately to Chandran's email. We will share his email to you all. Thank you very much. I'll give the time to Lucy, our chairman. Lucy?
Thank you very much, Chandran, for your wonderful talk to us. And you truly have a world view, which many of us do not have, because you have the very unique experiences of growing up in South Asian countries, and then you've been to London, you've been in the UK for a study, and after that, with your flying start in your career, you go to Africa for your anti-apartheid movement. So we have a lot of, really a lot of amaze at your achievement. And then you founded the world's largest global environmental consultant company, and you've been to 12 countries just for that part of the business, but you gave them up to found this Global Institute for Tomorrow. And then and I'm also proud that you are a Hong Konger because your base is also in Hong Kong. And you are truly multicultural, multi-faith, and very eclectic experience and interest. And I know that you are a saxophone player, you form a band, and then you are a hockey player, you almost on the national team for Malaysia. So this is really wonderful. You have a very clear world view.
Thank you so much.
And very inclusive. And we'd like to definitely, the Tannehill Workshop likes to cooperate further with you, because like you, we also have many views about this world, and we have members across the globe. They are mostly of Hong Kong origin, but however, we share your passion, and we have several interest groups in the Tannehill Workshop. They include a sustainability and special interest group, and we are forming them. And we also have better use of data science for analyzing the society. And also we have an education workshop, a special interest group that can align with you. So we hope that this is not the first, that this is not the last, this is only the beginning. And when you are back to Hong Kong, we'll look you up. Okay?
Thank you so much, Lucy. Thank you.
Soon.
And when I come back to Hong Kong, if you will have me again, I'd like to do it with lunch, and we have an in-person conversation, and that would be the greatest. But in the meantime, my colleagues and I would love to have your support. We know many of you have great experience, and what we're trying to do in Hong Kong needs the help of many. So, whichever way I can help, and where you can help us, I think that would be a wonderful. And I take your point. Let's make this the first small step in a 1,000-mile journey.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Peace to everyone. Enjoy the cold weather in Hong Kong. And
thank you.
Thank you.
Vincent, thank you.
Thank you, Vincent.
Thank
Take
you
care,
very much.
everyone.
Thank you.
Peace, everyone. Take care.
And then I think that Vincent Chen is going to announce the next two programs upcoming. And thank you so much, Chandran.
Thank you. Bye-bye, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.